네, 안녕하십니까?
Good morning. The 2022 KF Global Korean Studies Forum is joined by participants on site as well as online. I'd like to thank you all for being here. I am the MC, Yoon Chang-sik, Head of Korean Studies Department of the Korea Foundation. Thank you. I wonder what you thought of the opening video. Marking the 30th anniversary of KF, the video offered us a chance to take a quick look back on the institution's history. The topic of this forum is paradigm changes and future development of Korean studies. Professors from across the world have taken the time to join us for fulfilling sessions. Please be sure to stay with us until the end of the event. Now let us begin with opening remarks by President Lee Gun of the Korea Foundation. Please welcome President Lee with a big hand. Good morning. I am the president of the Korea Foundation, Lee Gun. Second Vice Minister Lee Do-hoon of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Secretary General Han Kyung-gu of the Korean National Commission for UNESCO, Professor Emeritus John Duncan of UCLA, scholars and members of the Korean Studies community, good morning. Despite the ongoing challenges posed by the COVID pandemic, you have joined us at the 2022 KF Global Korean Studies Forum. Thank you very much and welcome to the forum. The KF Global Korean Studies Forum, in order to celebrate the 30th anniversary of KF, was scheduled originally for last December, but was postponed as COVID-19 resurged. And today, at last, we are joined by more than 100 Korean studies experts from home and abroad, and I am grateful and delighted that the event is able to run smoothly. Since its inception in 1991, the KF has been promoting the brilliance of the Republic of Korea around the world and fostering favorable and cooperative relations by deploying comprehensive and systematic public diplomacy projects. Laying the foundation for Korean studies education and research at leading universities around the world through Korean studies support projects has been the biggest focus of KF since its founding. During the early days in the 1990s, the Korea Foundation sent visiting professors abroad to teach Korean studies and launched fellowship projects to produce researchers. It was then that the supporting framework for Korean studies was first established. Above all, during this time, leading universities were selected as focal points for promoting Korean studies and received concentrated support of the limited budget of the Korean Foundation. KF thereby made the funding impactful and strove to build a foundation for the development of Korean studies early on. In the 2000s, as part of efforts to nurture new scholars and broaden the research base, postdoc fellowship program and Korean studies resources support projects were launched. The Americas and Europe were the main destinations of Korean studies support projects, which were then expanded further to Southeast Asia and Latin America for regionally balanced development of Korean studies. Since 2010, Hallyu boosted the global demand for learning about Korea. Compared to the demand for Korean studies programs, the number of faculty fell far short. And so, KF tapped into the global university network it had built and the advanced IT of Korea, preemptively launching the online Korean studies courses under the KF Global eSchool project in 2011. As a result of 30 years' effort by KF to support Korean studies overseas, 98 universities in 20 countries have opened 153 Korean studies professorships, 8,200 researchers have received KF fellowship support, and 35,000 degree students a year receive tailored Korean studies courses. Most importantly, when I visit other countries for business and see firsthand how talents produced by our programs contribute to promoting relations between Korea and the world, I feel an enormous sense of pride and fulfillment as a member of the foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, paradigm changes and future development of Korean studies is the topic of this year's forum. We will look back on the achievements of Korean studies promotion projects and set the way forward by sharing insights with experts in diverse fields, and also look back on the hard work done by KF. Personally, I am curious if Korean studies will be able to grow to become more than a narrow discipline and evolve into general social sciences and human sciences, and also provide theoretical and empirical insights to other fields of research. And I hope that we can find the way forward toward this end today. In addition, as K-pop, drama, film, and other Korean-made contents are receiving so much global spotlight, I hope greater interest in Korea among the global masses can serve as the basis for our in-depth discussion on creating a sustainable ecosystem for Korean studies. Last but not least, thank you once again for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here. And as we celebrate the 30th anniversary of KF with this forum, I hope you have a wonderful time. Thank you.
네, 이근 이사장님.
President Kun Lee, thank you very much for your insightful speech. I believe that it was truly meaningful remarks opening up today's forum held in commemoration of the 30th anniversary of KF. Let me now invite Second Vice Minister Do Hoon Lee of the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs for his congratulatory speech. Please welcome him with a big hand.
네, 외교부 제2
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I am Second Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs. President Kun Lee of the Korea Foundation, Secretary General Kyung Koo Han of the Korean National Commission for UNESCO, Professor Emeritus John Duncan, distinguished guests from home and abroad. Despite the hot weather, we are joined by many participants at today's Korea Foundation Global Korean Studies Forum, and it's my pleasure to be a part of the event. Although it has been postponed for a year, I would like to congratulate the opening of this forum held in commemoration of last year's 30th anniversary of the foundation. The history of the Korea Foundation, founded in 1991, shares the development path of Korea, which joined the United Nations in the same year. As much as Korea's stature grew over the past 30 years since joining the United Nations, the international community's interest in and research on the Korean language and Korean studies has also made remarkable progress. In the process, the Korea Foundation, as the only public diplomacy institution designated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has been taking the lead in promoting global Korean studies. In terms of sheer size, Korean studies courses are now offered at 1,412 universities in 107 countries. More than 150 Korean Studies Chair professorships have been established at major overseas universities. Also, in terms of quality, Korean studies is expanding beyond the old preoccupation with Korean language and Korean history education to include to various fields such as economic development strategy, experience of democratization, and science, technology, and innovation policies. Distinguished guests from home and abroad. While the first image of Korea that came to mind in the past was focused on challenges on the Korean peninsula, including the North Korean nuclear issue, you can feel that in the recent years there is a shift in perception with a greater focus on Korean culture, science, technology, and innovation. As such, interest and expectations for Korea are growing beyond Hallyu contents to Korea's contribution to the future of the global community, which demands new responsibilities from us. Against this backdrop, the Korean government, under the vision of becoming a global pivotal state, promoting freedom, peace, and prosperity, is putting serious thought into how Korea can contribute to the creation of international order and norms in this period of transition. As an organization heading public diplomacy, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in order to promote Korean studies in line with this vision, has selected expanding the global base of Korean studies in Korean language as its priority task for public diplomacy. To this end, we plan to utilize our network of over 170 diplomatic missions abroad to provide more active support for the global expansion and development of Korean studies projects. The efforts of the Korea Foundation to expand the base of Korean studies must also evolve in line with this trend of the times. First and foremost, I would like to ask you to join forces so that Korea's effort and determination to contribute to the realization of global values stand out. Based on the experience of successful post-war restoration, cooperation in the restoration and build back of Ukraine is a good example. The Korean government's efforts to host the 2030 Busan World Expo also reflect our policy will for a better global future. Meanwhile, we need to have the high popularity of Hallyu make its way into increasing interest in Korean studies among the overseas public to eventually lead to mutual synergy. One good example is the KF Korea Studies e-school program launched in collaboration with BTS, of which the number of enrollments increased to approximately 14,000 participants. Furthermore, I would like to ask you to take full advantage of Korea's capabilities as a science and technology innovation power to expand creative ways to disseminate Korean studies by using diverse digital technologies such as metaverse and AI. While we are amid challenging circumstances due to the resurgence of COVID, I would like to commend the Korea Foundation for their hard work, nevertheless, to successfully host today's event, and I look forward to your continued efforts for the promotion and development of Korean studies. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would also be by your side. Thank you very much.
네, 차관님.
Thank you, Vice Minister, for your kind words. We were able to hear the Korean Studies promotion projects and way forward and plans forward, plan for by BOFA. And next, please join me in welcoming Secretary General Han Kyung-gu of the Korean National Commission for UNESCO for congratulatory remarks.
예, 이도훈 외교부
Second Vice Minister Lee Do-hoon of MOFA, President Lee Gun of KF, Professor John Duncan, scholars and experts of Korean studies from home and abroad, distinguished guests.
저는 과거의 연구자로서
As a researcher participating in the KF Global Korean Studies Forums as a presenter or panelist, I always thought congratulatory remarks were mere formality and wished they would pass by quickly, never paying attention. But now that I am the speaker, I think differently. Please pay attention. Above all, giving this congratulatory remark at the 2022 KF Global Korean Studies Forum is a true pleasure as a researcher. I am all the more delighted as the KNCU, or Korean National Commission for UNESCO, where I serve as Secretary General, has made important contributions to the development of Korean studies. As you all know, UNESCO was launched after the two world wars to address the ignorance, misunderstanding, bias, and hatred that people harbored against one another. Peace could not be reached with political and economic negotiations alone and required the intellectual and moral solidarity of the mankind to be permanent. Based on this belief, UNESCO implemented mutual understanding projects on cultural values of the East and West and other efforts to foster cultural understanding. The KNCU was also born while efforts were ongoing to overcome the devastations of the Korean War in the late 1950s and started work on deepening and disseminating the understanding of Korea. In 1957, the best scholars in Korea came together and published what can be likened to an encyclopedia of Korean culture, the UNESCO Korean Survey. In 1960, this was translated into English and sent out across the world. The Korean Journal was first published in 1961, starting as a monthly semi-journal, and later becoming a full-blown journal of Korean studies, contributing greatly to the research and education of Korean studies at home and abroad. As aspects of the Korean society developed remarkably and specialized institutions such as KF started to support Korean studies overseas, the KNCU gradually discontinued its Korean studies projects or transferred them elsewhere. Still, the KNCU is deeply interested in developing Korean studies and promoting and providing support. Korean studies have the painful history of having been initiated as Choson studies during the Japanese colonial rule. As soon as Korea was liberated, tragic division and war followed, and Korea only joined the UN in 1991. In this globalized world today, still many people expect the field of Korean studies to explore those that are uniquely Korean and to elucidate the characteristics and traditions of Korean culture. And there is great pressure to do so. We at the KNCU was also motivated to develop Korean studies by the strong urge to introduce Korea and its culture to the world and to gain recognition. However, Korean studies in a globalized world cannot be satisfied merely by studying what is only Korean and disseminating Korea's unique characteristics. We must examine the wide range of events and processes taking place in relation to Korea and uncover what is universal and explore the meaning, thereby deepening the understanding of people and this world. That is the way forward for Korean studies. As we beat after COVID-19 forced us to deeply ponder on national and ethnic borders, identity of individuals and groups, the human community, and local and global relations, this year's forum will be a meaningful platform to search for a way forward for Korean studies. I hope Korean studies encompass North Korea, the Korean diaspora, immigrants, and many other sectors, and continue to raise new topics and issues, develop theoretical discussions, and progress with full force. Then, Korean studies will truly become a key part of excellent public diplomacy. For Korean studies to go beyond raising national image or brand and solidify the intellectual and moral solidarity of the mankind, I ask MOFA and KF to send unsparing support. I would like to thank everyone for joining us. And with that, I would like to conclude my remarks. Thank you.
네, 한경구 사무총장님.
Yes, Secretary General Kyung-gu-han, thank you very much for your insightful comments for the foundation. Now is the time for the keynote speech that you all have been waiting for. Our keynote speaker for today is Professor Emeritus of Asian Languages and Cultures and History at UCLA, Professor John Duncan. Professor John Duncan, after serving as chair of the Association for Asian Studies Committee on Korean Studies, he served as a member of the steering committee of the Alliance of Scholars Concerned About Korea, as the executive chair of the Worldwide Consortium of Korean Studies, and as the executive member of the Korean Foundation eSchool Program for Latin America. Even after his retirement in 2019, he remains as an active contributor to research in Korean studies. So then, let us now invite Professor John Duncan to the stage. Please welcome him with a big round of applause.
이거 벗어도 되겠죠? 덥네요.
It's quite hot today, isn't it?
Good morning. And 안녕하세요. 지금까지 이근 이사장
President Kun Lee and all of our distinguished guests have given their comments in Korean. So I thought maybe I should also speak in Korean. So I'm torn between Korean and English. However, I did prepare my speech in English. And it's been 3 years since I came back to Korea, so I think that I need to further polish my Korean proficiency. So I do ask for your understanding, and I would like to conduct my speech in English.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. And thank you to the foundation, to President Egan for inviting me to this important occasion. I'm happy to be here, but it's also a great honor for me to be here because it is, as we know, an event that marks the 30th anniversary of the founding of the Korea Foundation. And I think we all know how important the role of the Korea Foundation has been in the development of Korean studies overseas over the past 30 years. I have been asked to share, one, my experience as a Korean studies scholar, two, my perspectives on the development of Korean studies overseas, three, my sense of potential problems or actual problems in the field, and four, my thoughts on the future of global Korean studies. That's a lot for 20 minutes. Please bear with me. I first went to Korea as a soldier in the United States Army in the late 1960s, and I spent a little over 2 years serving along the demilitarized zone. It wasn't a very nice time to be on the DMZ, but yes, I survived, got through okay. While I was there as a soldier, I became fascinated by Korean culture, Korean society. And so I did all I could to study the Korean language and to learn a bit about Korean society, Korean culture, and Korean history while I was in the Army. After I got discharged from the Army, I came back to Korea. I spent another year or so working very hard on my Korean. And then I enrolled as an undergraduate student at Korea University. I ended up getting my bachelor's degree from Korea University with a concentration in Korean history. Then I went back to the United States for graduate work, eventually getting my PhD at the University of Washington, of course in Korean history. After that, I spent 30 years teaching about Korea at UCLA, Korean history, Korean thought, Korean language. I taught both undergraduate and graduate students. Some of my undergraduate classes had as many as 270 or 280 students, which is way too many. I also taught many graduate students and was either the advisor or sat on the dissertation committees for over 40 PhD students, not only from the United States, but from throughout the world. I was busy. I have also been a visiting scholar at, well, first of all, Boise State University in Idaho, then Harvard, Kyushu University in Japan, and the University of Malaga in Spain. Those were all good experiences, and I learned a lot. I participated in joint teaching and research projects with many scholars from outside the United States. Most of the joint teaching has been done with Korean professors. The joint research projects have been done with scholars from Asia, from Latin America, and from Europe. So it's this kind of experience that I will draw upon for the observations that I proffer today. So now I will talk a bit about the development of Korean studies outside Korea. As we all know, Koreans had been studying themselves since at least the early centuries of the current era. And we know that there are entries on Korea, descriptions of Korea in standard histories of Chinese dynasties, going back to early times. But what we might call the modern study of Korea really began in the late 19th and early 20th century by Japanese scholars and by Western missionaries and journalists. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that we found Korean studies professors actually holding positions, regular positions, in Western universities. When I started my graduate studies in the 1970s, in the Anglophone world, you could get PhDs in Korean studies at Harvard, at Berkeley, at Hawaii, at the University of Washington, in Columbia. And you could find undergraduate training, at least undergraduate classes on Korea at such places as Indiana University, Brigham Young University, and SOAS. There was other stuff happening in France and in the countries of the Soviet bloc, but I'll wear you out if I start going through all of that. So I will abbreviate and move on. Now, by my calculation, we have almost 40 universities worldwide with PhD programs in Korean studies, and many others offering substantial training on Korea at the bachelor's level, bachelor's degree level. One thing that really struck me was, again, this is my calculation, but in the three countries of China, Japan, and the United States, there are over 700 colleges and universities, including, of course, community colleges, that teach the Korean language. 700 schools in just those three countries. That's a lot. How do we explain the rapid growth of Korean studies? Such a different world from what I knew when I started graduate school in the 1970s. Well, some of the factors are obvious, right? The dynamic Korean economy, South Korea as having become an important middle power in diplomatic circles, continuing tensions with North Korea, tensions between Korea and Japan, and of course, Korean popular culture. There are other less obvious but still important factors, one of which, just to give an example, has been the coming of age of immigrant youth in the United States and Canada, and this is possibly also true in places like Great Britain, France, and Germany. The children, typically 1.5 generation of Korean immigrants, began to arrive on campuses at U.S. universities in large numbers in the 1980s. They got there and they discovered that their universities were teaching about Japan and teaching about China and offered nothing on Korea. These students organized, and they demanded that courses be established to teach the Korean language and to teach about Korean culture. Universities, for the most part, responded positively. Certainly my university, UCLA, was one of those that responded positively to student demand for courses on Korea. And I was the beneficiary of that student demand. So I'm always grateful to the students. By the 1990s, those same 1.5 immigrant young people were getting their PhDs and starting to teach Korean studies at various universities in the United States and elsewhere. That was a great, a very important change, I think. So that was what was going on inside the United States and to some degree other places in the world. But I think we have to pay some attention to the role of various entities inside Korea in the rapid development of Korean studies worldwide. One thing I can mention is the creation of international divisions, both graduate and undergraduate, at various universities in Korea. I can mention the way in which Korean universities have very actively pursued exchange students with overseas universities. And I know that Korean university faculty are often seeking to do joint research projects with overseas professors. So all of that has really helped, I think, to improve the status of Korean studies. Then there are entities inside Korea. There was a Korea Research Foundation back in the 1980s that provided some support for Western academics interested in Korea. There was the Academy of Korean Studies, which has been very active since the mid-2000s. And since 2007, we also have the King Sejong Institute, active both in communities and schools throughout the world. But I seek here today to highlight the Korea Foundation, not just because it is the host of this event, but because it really played the crucial role in the takeoff years for Korean studies overseas. What I'm going to say here is duplicates a little bit what President Lee said, but I'll make it very quick. The Korea Foundation has created professorships throughout the world. It has established endowments for some universities. It has supported library collections. It has provided fellowships for graduate students. It has also given fellowships for individuals to come to Korea for field research and language training. It has supported various Korean Studies associations. I noticed as I was sitting down there and watching the slideshow, they mentioned many things that the Korea Foundation has done to support Korean studies overseas. And I saw Harvard, and I saw all these other schools, Columbia, and the University of Pennsylvania. I didn't see mention of UCLA. So I'm here to correct any false impression you may have gotten from that. At UCLA, this is to give you an example of what the foundation has done. 3 of the 12 Korean Studies professorships that we have were created with funding from the Korea Foundation. The Korea Foundation has given us a great deal of support for our library collection. The Korea Foundation over the years has provided scores of fellowships for our graduate students. Korea Foundation has provided funding for visiting lecturers who could cover areas that we were not able to do with our faculty. The Korea Foundation gave us seed money for an endowment. And the Korea Foundation created the Latin America E-School, centered at that time at UCLA, from 2011 to 2014. And has since continued to support the Latin America E-School at the Autonomous University of Nuevo León in Mexico since that time. So it is simply impossible to imagine the flourishing state we now have in Korean studies without the contributions and the leadership of the Korea Foundation. I have talked a bit about the numerical expansion of Korean studies overseas, but there's been a great change also in the scope and the focus of Korean studies. Up until the 1980s, in the humanities, almost all of the scholars were studying pre-modern history and pre-modern literature. In the social sciences, most scholars were political scientists or international relations specialists, although there were a few people who made important contributions in anthropology and linguistics. Now, if you look at the humanities, it's almost completely a focus on modern contemporary Korea. There has been an expansion of interests into religion, into art history, film, ethnomusicology, and other fields. This has been good. Social sciences now have many more faculty than before. We see quite a few in sociology. We see people doing economics. We see people doing linguistics, law, and other fields. I'd also would like to note that there has been an increase in interdisciplinary research among humanists and social scientists in such topics as gender, migration, adoption, and labor. So it's kind of an exciting time. We've also seen tremendous growth in the number of publications. We now have several major university presses in the West with Korea series. It includes SOAS, University of Hawaii, University of Washington, University of Michigan, University of California, and Harvard. And universities in other countries, such as the Netherlands, Chile, and Russia, have established substantial records of publication in recent years. When I first started graduate school, there were maybe 2 or 3, maybe 4 English language journals devoted to Korean studies. Now, by my latest tabulation, it's about 20 worldwide. It's not just North America, it's in Latin America. A lot of quality English language journals now being published in Korea, they're published in Europe. That's been a big change. Also, what's important is that articles on Korea are increasingly appearing in journals that are not specifically Korean studies journals. And this is important. We need to get the word out about Korea to the broader scholarly community. And of course, all you have to do is go poking around on YouTube and you will find fools like me up there giving supposed scholarly talks on Korea. In short, Korea is at long last in the spotlight on the global scholarly stage. I have some concerns, however, about the state of the field. Some of them are obvious, some of them not so obvious. And some of them are particular to my own situation as a pre-modernist. One thing that's bothered me for a long time has been the phenomenon of vanishing Korean studies programs and vanishing Korean studies positions. I've seen time and again programs that have withered and died after one or two key people either retired or took up a position at another university. Of course, this is a difficult problem to deal with, particularly I think from the foundation's perspective, because every university has its own distinctive culture, its own priorities, and its own politics. It's hard to come up with a one-size-fits-all solution. But in my observation in programs that have managed to survive, the founders of those programs have done a number of things. One, they were very good at cultivating support from their university's administrations. Robert Buswell at UCLA was a master at that. Amazing man. The founders also worked really hard to develop cooperative relations with their colleagues who were doing other countries in Asia, China, Japan, India, wherever it may be. They also worked hard to integrate Korea into the disciplinary curricula, to get Korea represented in regular sort of survey courses in sociology, world history, these kinds of things. And they also really encouraged their students to be active in supporting their programs and in letting the administration know that the programs were needed and valuable. Anyway, we should all think a bit about how we can ensure that beginning programs in Korean studies survive the founding generation. I think that's an important issue. Number two, number three, I guess it is. This is me talking. I'm very concerned about the certain imbalance we see in recent development. As I said before, once we were all pre-modernists, now everybody is doing modern contemporary. There are good reasons for this. And the dynamic Korean economy attracts a lot of attention. Korean popular culture, whatever we want to call it, Hallyu, K-pop, whatever, has really drawn a lot of students in. And a lot of young scholars are very interested in that. Also, there have been the theoretical trends of recent decades. Things such as post-colonial studies that have led younger scholars to look at modern and contemporary. And finally, of course, there's a lack of jobs. At least in the United States, universities don't want to hire people doing old stuff. They want to hire people who's doing the new, hot, sexy stuff that will bring in lots of students. So it's tough. But I believe that any school that is producing PhDs in Korean studies should have at least one pre-modernist in its faculty. Why? Well, because I have seen several instances in which very bright, very talented younger scholars have produced very dubious conclusions about the nature of the modern Korean transformation because they had no idea what the starting point was. Language training. Those of you who know me know I talk about this a lot. Whereas Ross King and I, we bang on our drum all the time. Well, Korean is hard. We all know that. It's really hard. And I think of earlier generation of Western scholars of Korea, particularly the United States. These guys and these gals were really good scholars. They produced some excellent work, but it took them a long time because although they had good reading skills in Korean, they still had to rely on dictionaries, and they had to do a lot of work to contextualize what they were doing. So it was slow, but more almost tragic, I would say, was that generation's inability to interact substantially with their Korean colleagues, to present papers, write papers, or present papers in Korean, to engage in question and answer sessions, serious discussion. It just didn't happen. And so there has long been a huge gap in the way that Western scholars have seen Korean history and the way that Korean scholars have seen their history. Now, if you look at the bulk of graduate students in the United States and Canada, and this is possibly true also in Europe, most of the PhD students are either one so-called 1.5 generation Korean Americans, Korean Canadians, or they are overseas students from Korea, 유학생. Why? They're the only ones who have the language skills. The language training at most universities in the West is limited. 2 years, maybe 3 years. And as I mentioned earlier, even 4 years of college level Korean does not get you to the level where you can actually do research, primary source research in Korean materials. And we face, throughout the United States and Canada, and this is probably true in Europe as well, a lot of pressure from our administrations on the issue of time to degree. They think that we should all produce time to degree like engineering schools or science schools do. 4 or 5 years and people should have their PhDs. In a field like Korean studies, it doesn't work that way. But our institutions have instituted these time degree limitations, which means that after about your 5th year, no more funding. So somebody who doesn't come in with really good Korean language skills to begin with cannot hope to successfully complete a PhD in the Korean humanities. I think the students from Korea and the Korean American students have brought and continue to bring important, wonderful perspectives to the study of Korea. And some of the PhDs whom I trained, of whom I am the most proud, are Korean American students and students from Korea. But there's a little bit of a problem here. We run the risk of there being a widely held perception that Korean studies is about Korea, by Koreans, and for Koreans. And that could hinder our ability to truly globalize Korean studies. Instead of creating little K-town ghettos of Korean studies in different places, we need to make it clear that Korean studies is for everybody. Another issue that I've talked about before, and I will talk about again if I'm given an opportunity, is the dominant position in worldwide Korean studies of English language scholarship, especially that produced in the United States. It is often very good, but it has been and still is produced in a particularly U.S. environment. During my time, it was very much the Cold War that sort of set the parameters of what you did in Korean studies. And it doesn't mean that it always translates directly into international relations or studying North Korean communism or something. It also affected the ways in which U.S. scholars studied Korean history. Under the influence of modernization theory, they were trying to figure out why Korea had failed to modernize on its own. And therefore, they were looking back at the Chosun period to see what the problems were, what the distinctive features were of Korean society that hindered its modernization. Yeah, I know all about that. I was part of that. So, there's that. There are the particular relations that exist between the United States and Korea. In many ways, kind of problematic relationship. And there is the U.S. interest in promoting the free flow of goods, capital, and culture throughout the world. So all of these things have come together to produce, I think, rather views of Korea, scholarship on Korea that is very much influenced by, consciously or unconsciously, by the interests of the United States. To the extent that scholars from other countries are dependent or reliant on English language scholarship to do their research, they are, as one of my close colleagues and friends in Mexico reminded me, limited in their ability to develop distinctive views on Korea. All of us should approach U.S. scholarship with critical eyes. And those of us in such major countries as the United States, Japan, China, and Russia must be aware of our own positionality. Must be acutely aware of our positionality. Sorry for all the chansori. I'll move on to prospects for the future. Prognostication is risky, so I'm going to be brief and careful. The recent growth, the trajectory of growth of Korean studies and the enduring popularity of Korean popular culture suggests that Korean studies will probably continue to prosper in the foreseeable future. But our turbulent times pose threats. This apparently never-ending COVID-19 pandemic has made it very difficult for us to do much of what we normally do as scholars. It's much harder to have meetings, conferences. Even though we might do Zoom, I find that very limited, unsatisfactory. We can't even hold our regular classes. We're doing our undergraduate and graduate classes on Zoom. In the case of one of the last graduate classes that I taught, we had about 7 or 8 students, and only one was in Los Angeles, another was in Vancouver, British Columbia, one was in Japan, one was in Beijing, one was in New York. So the students themselves are not getting together and having the kind of exchange that leads to really good intellectual development. Yes. We have pandemics, we have climate change. I'm particularly aware of that because I live in California. I'm sure that my friends who live in Australia understand what I'm talking about. And I think my friends in Europe are getting a taste of what we've been putting up with for quite some time now. It's tough. And it poses certain limitations on what we can do. Well, what bothers me the most, perhaps, is the rise of the rise of right-wing populist nationalism. Korea and Korean studies have benefited from the kind of globalization that we have seen in recent decades. There's no question about it. But the kind of conservative or right-wing populist nationalism that bothers me, as seen, for example, in Donald Trump's America First claptrap, is actually a reaction against globalization. And this concerns me about the closing of minds, about people losing interest in learning about foreign cultures and appreciating what other countries, other cultures have to offer. So I think we all need to think hard about how do we counter this, what is to me at least, a very distressful trend. But in closing, I would like to say, I have seen over the past almost 60 years South Korea deals successfully with many difficulties. Extreme poverty of the kind that I saw in the 1960s. Repeated financial crises, spectacular, which was 1997, but there were others. Threats from North Korea, military coup d'etat, and political oppression. South Korea has overcome all of these kinds of difficulties. And that leaves me cautiously optimistic that Korea and Korean studies will continue to develop in the foreseeable future. I'm going to add one little note here because this is something that I've long felt strongly about. I've always appreciated the kind of leadership that the Korea Foundation has had. The various men and women who have acted, who have served as the Isajang, as the presidents of the foundation, had vision. They had leadership, as typified in the current President Kun Lee. But also I would like to add that I have always found the Korea Foundation staff to be really good to work with. They are knowledgeable, they are courteous, they are professional. And so we can thank the people who conceived of having a Korea Foundation to begin with. We can thank the high-level leadership of the Korea Foundation. We also need to thank the ordinary men and women who have done the important work in the foundation over the years. Thank you very much.
네, 존 던컨 교수님.
Professor John Duncan, thank you for sharing with us your invaluable past footsteps
교수님께서 언급하신 대로
and the outcome of the long-term research in Korean studies. Yes, in the opening video as mentioned, UCLA actually was excluded, but I do want to mention that UCLA has been engaged in multiple Korean studies program, has active research underway with Korean studies, and also has a very long-standing relationship with our foundation, so we want to make that clear as well. Once again, thank you very much for your affection in Korean studies as well as your excellent lecture, and why don't we give him a big round of applause. We look forward to your insightful research in the future as well.
네. 이로써 2021
This brings us to the end of the opening ceremony of the 2022 KF Global Korean Studies Forum. We'd now like to take a short break, rearrange the stage, and begin session 1. I will see you back in a little while. Thank you.